Hello, everyone. Welcome to From Hormones to Egg Freezing, Understanding Your Fertility with Fairy Godboss and Modern Fertility. We are so excited to be here with all of you today, and we'll give everyone just a few seconds to log on. While we do that, you'll notice you have a chat function that you can use and also a Q&A function. We'll be taking questions at the end, and if you have anything you want to chime in, like if you can hear me, would love to see you drop that in the chat. And you also have the option of sharing your questions or chat anonymously. I'm hoping people can hear me. No one's in the chat. Dr. Burke, can you hear me? Oh, okay, people are chiming in. People can hear me. Good. Thank you. All right, well, my name is Marian. I am with Fairy Godboss. We are the largest career community for women, and we are thrilled to be partnering with our friends at Modern Fertility to talk a little bit about our hormones. For those of you not familiar with Fairy Godboss, we are a platform where women can anonymously review their employers, apply for jobs, connect and engage with one another in our community, and also access fabulous career content, some of which we have recently produced with our friends at Modern to tell the fertility journeys of several women. And that's kind of how this webinar came to life. And we're so excited all of you could join us. So today I'm joined by Dr. Erin Burke, who runs research and clinical operations at Modern Fertility. Erin comes to us from Yale, where she received her PhD in biological anthropology. As part of her program, she was the lead researcher on one of the most fascinating studies, where she tracked hormone changes in gay fathers over time. So needless to say, she's definitely a hormone expert. So I'm really excited to have her walk us through all of this important information today. So I'm guessing for many of us, it's probably been a while since our last sex ed class or a biology class. So some of the words you might be hearing today, like follicle or ovulation, you might be thinking to yourself, I can't quite remember what that does. And there's absolutely no shame in that. I know I need a refresher, and that's why we're here. So we're going to start with a quick refresher of the female reproductive system, so we're all starting on the same page. Then we're going to do a deep dive into hormones, answering questions like, what's a hormone? What does a hormone do? What does it mean when you say I'm hormonal? Something we say a lot, but do we even know what that means? And then finally, we want this to be a really practical talk. So we're going to end with some information on menopause, egg freezing, and IVF. Things you may have heard a lot about, but don't have the actual details on. And I know I am really looking forward to getting all those details as well. And as a final note, I just want to say that we would like to welcome questions throughout this event. So feel free to chime in as we go along. You can use the Q&A feature of the webinar. And again, you can ask anonymously as well. And so without further ado, I am going to hand it off to Dr. Burke.
Great. Thanks so much, Mary, and thank you everyone for joining today for this webinar. So yeah, as Mary said, I think it'd be a great idea to just take a second and kind of get everyone on the same playing field and re-meet our reproductive systems. So here's your reproductive system, the female reproductive system. And as a quick refresher, every month, one of your ovaries ovulates. And what happens during that process of ovulation is that an egg travels outside the ovary into the fallopian tube. And it hangs out in that kind of squiggly little part of the fallopian tube for about 24 hours. And what it's doing there is it's waiting for sperm to come and meet it. And so if fertilization occurs in the fallopian tube, the fertilized egg is going to travel to your uterus. And once it gets to the uterus, it is going to implant in the endometrium, which is a big fancy word for your uterine lining. So if fertilization occurs, implantation occurs, then the implanted egg starts sending messages through hormonal signals to your body that you're pregnant, and then that endometrium eventually turns into the placenta and a pregnancy starts happening. If that doesn't happen, then every month you get your period. That means you shed that uterine lining. So hopefully this should sound a bit familiar to everybody here. So your ovaries actually trade off doing this. 1 month, one ovary will ovulate an egg, and the next month, the other ovary will ovulate. So what's the deal with hormones? How do they play into this system? Well, hormone is simply the body's chemical messenger. So what hormones do is they travel around the body and they look for specific cells to target, and then they deliver a set of instructions to that cell and tell it to do something specific. And really, hormones control pretty much everything. So any kind of bodily system that you can think of, there's a hormone or a suite of hormones that help control that bodily system. So we're talking anything from growth to the fight or flight response, to hunger, to mood. If you can think of something the body does, there's a hormone for that. And when we think about reproductive hormones, specifically female fertility hormones, there's a bunch of different hormones at play. Here are 8 hormones. Some of them might look pretty familiar, but these are the hormones that if you were to go to a fertility clinic and get your hormones tested, these are the ones that the doctor would look at. So again, some of them might look pretty familiar. We have estradiol, which is a type of estrogen. There's also testosterone. You might think of that as a male hormone, but actually women have testosterone as well. And then other hormones like prolactin, which is prolactation. It supports the lactation when you're breastfeeding a baby. But there's quite a few hormones on this slide, and we only have you guys for a little less than an hour. So we are going to concentrate on one particular hormone this morning or afternoon, depending on where you guys are, and that is anti-Müllerian hormone, or AMH. Okay, so let's head back really quick to the female reproductive system. So again, this entire process of ovulation, the egg traveling to the fallopian tube, then to the uterus, implantation, pregnancy, or menstruation, that's all governed by those reproductive hormones in the last slide. But what we're going to do is we're going to zoom into the very first part of this process, and we're going to see what's going on at the level of the ovary. So this is a cross-section of your ovary, and there's a couple structures in here that are pretty important. So these first structures that I want to highlight are what are called follicles. So follicles are the cellular structures that surround and protect your egg. So these kind of little red cells that are on the outside of these structures, those are the cells that make up the follicles. Inside those cells are follicular fluid, and then the little red dots in the middle are your actual eggs. So every follicle surrounds and protects an egg. And what happens in your ovaries every month is that a cohort of follicles, about 10 to 20, start the process of folliculogenesis. So folliculogenesis pretty much just means the growth and maturation of follicles in your ovaries. So these 10 follicles start maturation, and then eventually one of these follicles becomes what we call the lead or the dominant follicle. And this is the follicle that eventually ovulates the egg outside of the ovary. And what's really important here is that there's only one egg that ovulates every month, because we're humans. We usually have singleton births, sometimes twins, but most commonly singleton births. So there's only that one lead follicle that actually ovulates. Okay, so when we talk about AMH, AMH is super important in this process, because what AMH does is it is a hormone that is created by those cells in the follicles. Those little red cells on the outside of these structures are creating AMH. And interestingly, AMH is also sending messages to the follicles. So what AMH does is it tells the follicles to stay small. It makes sure that not all of these 10 to 20 follicles become the dominant follicle. Once the dominant follicle gets to be around 8 millimeters, that's when it stops producing AMH, which then allows it to be sensitive to other hormonal signals that eventually results in ovulation. So what's really important about AMH is because it's created by this pool of small follicles that are kind of waiting in the wings, if you're able to measure AMH, you then have a proxy for how many eggs you have in your ovaries or ovarian reserve. And it's important to be able to measure ovarian reserve in women because female fertility changes with age. So these two circles represent the ovary of a 20-year-old and the ovary of a 40-year-old. So you'll probably notice two big differences between these two. The first difference, the most obvious difference, is that there are more eggs or more follicles in the ovary of a 20-year-old than the ovary of a 40-year-old. That's because the quantity of eggs in your ovaries declines over age. But there's also another difference, and that's that the ovary of a 20-year-old has more of these kind of white-looking follicles, while the ovary of a 40-year-old has some of these that are a little bit darker blue. So those color differences are representing changes in quality. So not only does the quantity of eggs in your ovaries change as you get older, but the ratio of quality also changes. So you have more unhealthy eggs as you get older. And by unhealthy eggs, what I mean are eggs that are non-viable, eggs that even if they are fertilized, won't be able to result in a pregnancy or a healthy pregnancy. So a lot of people ask, okay, well, this changes over age, but how many eggs do you actually have? How many eggs are you born with? How many eggs do you have once you reach menopause? So this table shows kind of what it looks like on average, the number of eggs that you have over the course of your life. So one number should really jump out at you at first, and that's that you actually have the most number of eggs at 20 weeks gestation, which is when you're about halfway through your mom's pregnancy. That's when you have about 6 million eggs. And then between 20 weeks gestation and birth, you go down to 1 million eggs. So what is happening to those 5 million eggs? Where did they go? You're obviously not using them. You're not ovulating them. You're still an embryo. So what's happening there? Well, what happens is that there's this process of quality control. So this happens with all the other cells in your body. When you're an embryo, when you're a fetus, and you're going through a lot of cell division, eventually at one point, your body has created all these cells. It then goes through and has a quality control where it only keeps the cells that are of the best quality. This happens with your neuron cells as well. All the cells in the body do this. So that by the time you're born, you're down to your 1 million best eggs. And that process is called follicular atresia. So that's programmed cell death. And when that programmed cell death goes awry, you have things like cancer. This is a totally normal thing in the body that your cells go through programmed cell death. So by the time you get to birth, you've got 1 million eggs. But then between birth and puberty, you've lost about, several other thousand eggs. You're down to 400,000 eggs. So what's happening there? Between birth and puberty, you're not using your eggs. And that is that process of follicular atresia is still happening. And that happens at about the rate of 1,000 follicles per month. And that happens all the way until you reach menopause, which is when you have 0 follicles. And menopause is clinically defined as going 12 months without having a period. So once you go 12 consecutive months without a period, that means your ovaries have exhausted all of the follicles or eggs that you had in your ovarian reserve. So what does this look over the course of your lifespan when we talk about AMH? So to get oriented to this graph really quickly, the bottom x-axis is your age, and then we have 2 lines. The blue line stands for non-growing follicle recruitment, which is just another way to kind of talk about the number of eggs in your ovaries. That's your ovarian reserve. And the red line is AMH. So you'll notice that around your mid-20s, AMH and follicles track pretty closely over the course of your life. That relationship is 0.96, which is pretty close to a perfect 1-to-1 relationship. So what's really awesome about AMH is that if you can measure your AMH levels in your blood, then you have an idea for what this decline in ovarian reserve looks like over the course of your life. Where before we were able to do this kind of non-invasive AMH testing, there was no really good way to be able to tell how many how many eggs in the ovaries of an individual. So really, knowing AMH provides more insight into your fertility than just your age alone. Okay, but we want to make this really kind of a practical conversation. Great, you know your AMH levels, but what does that mean? What can you actually do with that information? So I want to take a little bit of time to talk about your reproductive career and then also discuss egg freezing and IVF. So what I mean by reproductive career is really the time between puberty and menopause. And I think we spend a lot of time, especially in health ed classes and, with your parents and, informally discussing puberty. People are really well informed going into puberty that your body is going to go through physical changes. And then we spend a lot of time, especially in our 20s, 30s, 40s, really talking about preventing pregnancy, trying not to get pregnant, talking with your friends about birth control, talking with your gynecologist about different methods to avoid pregnancy. And then we really don't spend that much time actually discussing getting pregnant. It kind of is a bit of a mystery. Sometimes, we assume that getting pregnant is quite easy, and then when people actually go to try to get pregnant, it's a bit more difficult than we actually thought. And that's kind of a disservice. And then we spend almost no time, I believe, talking about menopause. Menopause being, again, the end of our reproductive career, when you go 12 months without having a period. And just like with puberty and also with the hormonal changes that you go through when you're getting pregnant, menopause has a bunch of different hormonal changes that occur. So this graph shows 3 different periods. The first is perimenopause, or what is now commonly referred to as the menopausal transition. And then the next is menopause. So that's that 12 months that you're going without a period. And then the third part of this graph is postmenopause. So what's really interesting is that during the menopausal transition, that's when your body is coming towards the end of its ovarian reserve. And when that happens, that means that no longer does your body have 2 different very important hormones, estrogen and progesterone, because those are produced by the eggs and by the act of ovulation. So when you're no longer ovulating regularly, your body no longer has a constant supply of estrogen and progesterone. So you'll see on this graph that the red line is estrogen levels, and those levels are going up and down during the menopausal transition. And that's when women start to experience all of these different symptoms of menopause. So, classic things like night sweats, hot flashes, those kinds of things. But there's actually quite a lot of other symptoms that come along with menopause. So hair loss is one of them. Memory loss is another. Weight gain, vaginal atrophy, lots of different kind of symptoms that if you aren't aware that they are related to menopause, you might think that something actually much more serious is happening, when really this is just the natural end of your reproductive career, and these are natural changes that you can expect. Doesn't mean that they're not uncomfortable, but that they're not to be unexpected. And so what's also important to realize is that the average age of menopause in the United States is 51. But these changes start occurring up to 10 years before you go 12 months without a period. So the menopausal transition, if you do the math, can happen sometimes in your early 40s or even late 30s. And so when these changes are occurring and you're not realizing that they could be attributed to menopause, you might think something more serious is occurring. For example, we've had women who tell us that they suddenly started having memory loss, or they were experiencing horrible insomnia, and they thought they had early onset Alzheimer's or cancer. So it's really important to realize that these symptoms can be just the natural symptoms that are associated with the end of your reproductive career. So how AMH plays into this is that because AMH, again, is secreted by the follicles in your ovaries, and it represents your ovarian reserve, if you have low AMH for your age, what it can do is predict that you will have potentially an earlier age of menopause. Whereas if you have high AMH for your age, it can predict a later age of menopause.
And I'm going to quickly jump in here. Hi, everyone. This is Janelle. I'm working on Q&A here for the webinar, and we have a question that just came in, which is how rapidly does AMH change year over year once you hit your 30s?
That's a really great question, because I think probably a lot of us have heard, oh, when you hit 30, or sometimes when you hit 35, you go off this reproductive cliff and it's very hard to get pregnant. Actually, this decline is gradual, but the decline changes for every woman. And so what we usually recommend is that if you want to be able to kind of create that AMH graph, like I showed a couple slides ago, you need to actually be able to test yourself every year and kind of to be able to track that decline. Which is really helpful, because if that decline is really steep, that can tell you that you might again be hitting menopause earlier. But if it's not as steep, you might not need to worry. And I didn't mention this, but though the average age of menopause is 51, that spread can be anywhere from 40 to 60. So that's 20 years difference where women can naturally hit menopause. So it's really helpful to know where in that 20 years you can expect to potentially hit menopause.
Great. And we actually have one more question that I wanted to jump in with, which is, I want to have my AMH levels tested, but I'm on birth control, the pill. Will being on the pill affect my test results? My doctor told me it would, but I've also heard the opposite.
So the really great thing about AMH is that you can actually test it while you're on birth control. AMH is pretty steady throughout the cycle. It is slightly suppressed on birth control, and there's only been a couple studies that have actually looked at this so far, and they've only studied certain birth controls. So the kind of common knowledge is that if you are on a combined oral contraceptive, so that's something that includes estrogen and progesterone, What that usually does is stops you from ovulating. So we think that that suppresses a bit the follicular activity in your ovaries. And so that can decrease your AMH a bit, but it's not like it's going to decrease your AMH by 50% or something like that. So what we recommend is that if you're on birth control, absolutely test your AMH. If it comes back extremely low and you're concerned about that, in consultation with your doctor, you might want to consider retesting about 3 months after you go off birth control. But again, that's a personal decision you should make with your doctor. But great question. Okay, so I wanted to switch over and talk a little bit about egg freezing and IVF. I think a lot of people have questions about egg freezing. It's become much more popular in recent years, but the actual steps that you have to take in this process are kind of more mysterious. So egg freezing has been around for a while. It was first used, especially with women in adolescence who were going through cancer treatments, women who had not already completed their families. So when you're going through cancer treatments, chemo and radiation are very toxic to your ovaries. So egg freezing was used as a way to freeze the eggs of women before they went through these cancer treatments so that they could then use their own eggs to get pregnant after their cancer treatments were completed. In 2014, the American Society for Reproductive Medicine put out a statement that said that egg freezing is no longer experimental and could be open to the public. And so now you'll hear it called often elective egg freezing or social egg freezing. I prefer elective egg freezing. And so the idea behind this is that if you are younger and you're interested in having a kid in the future and not right now, in order to kind of get ahead of that decline in egg quantity and egg quality, freeze your eggs at a younger age and then be able to use them at an older age when you want to start your family. So what happens with egg freezing is you first have to make an appointment with a fertility specialist, which is called a reproductive endocrinologist. So you'll make an appointment with your fertility specialist. They'll do a full workup that will include measuring your hormones, including AMH. And they'll also do something that's called an antral follicle count, where they actually take an ultrasound of your ovaries so that they can be able to kind of count the number of follicles that are in your ovaries to kind of see what number of follicles are maturing during that cycle. If everything looks great, they will send you off with a prescription for hormones. And so these are hormones that you will inject in yourself in your lower back every morning and every evening for about 1 to 2 weeks, depending on your course of treatment. And what these hormones do is that they grow the follicles in your ovaries, that cohort of follicles. Instead of just the one becoming the dominant follicle, all 10 to 20 of those follicles are going to grow. That's what these hormones are telling those follicles to do. So you'll be monitored during your hormone injections, and then eventually when your doctor sees that you have enough follicles that have matured, usually doctors want a minimum of 4, but usually 10 to 20 again is a good number, they will book you for your retrieval appointment. So during retrieval, it's an outpatient appointment, but you are under anesthesia. A doctor will insert a long needle through the vaginal canal and up into the ovaries, and then one by one they will suck out all of your follicles from one ovary, and then they will suck out the follicles, again the maturing follicles, from the other ovary, and then they will preserve them. So they're preserved in liquid nitrogen. It's very, very cold. We're talking, deep freeze here. And once you then would like to use those follicles, you'll come back, the follicles will be warmed up, and then you can have them transferred. So what we like to talk about when we talk about egg freezing is the fact that it's really not an insurance policy. If you have a good number of follicles retrieved, let's just say you have 10 follicles retrieved, that doesn't necessarily mean you'll be able to have 10 children with those follicles. So we'll make the math easy, say 10 follicles, and then go through the process. So if you have 10 follicles frozen, you want to go use them, the follicles have to be warmed. Not all those follicles are going to survive the warming process. So now we're down to about 8 or 9 follicles. Then those follicles have to be inseminated. They have to be fertilized. Not all of them are going to be able to be successfully fertilized. So now we're down to, let's say, 7 follicles. Then those follicles those fertilized eggs have to turn into an embryo, about a 4 to 8 cell embryo. Not all of them are going to develop properly into that embryo. So now we're down to about 5. And then they have to be transferred to your uterus and they have to implant. So now we're down to, let's say, 4. So this is why doctors want a minimum of 4 eggs retrieved during an egg retrieval process. If you're not able to get a good number, around 10 to 20, that usually means you'll have to go through several different processes of egg retrieval. And the science has definitely improved over the years. There's new freezing technologies that are available, but again, it's not a perfect science. And so it's important to remember that even if you have a large number of eggs, that doesn't mean that you'll be able to successfully have that number of children. Okay, so let's talk about in vitro fertilization really quickly. It's the same process, in vitro fertilization, as egg freezing for the first 2 steps. But after the retrieval process, instead of then freezing the eggs, what you'll do is you will then create an embryo with those eggs by fertilizing them. So you'll take a sperm sample either from your partner or a sperm donor and then fertilize those eggs outside the body in a petri dish. And then a specialist called an embryologist will pretty much babysit those eggs, fertilize eggs until they become embryos. So about a 4 to 8 cell embryo. That's called a blastocyst. And then sometimes those embryos are frozen. Usually the success rates are a bit better if you freeze the embryos right after they're created, let your uterus kind of chill out because you've just been pumping it full of hormones for about 1 to 2 weeks, and then come back and do the transfer later. And so then those embryos are thawed, they're then transferred, and then you're given other hormones to be able to help prep your uterus for that transfer and then the subsequent pregnancy.
And we actually have one question here I wanted to quickly jump in, which is how successful is egg freezing generally?
So again, if you think about the numbers, let's just say, again, if you have 10 eggs that are frozen, the survival rate, depending on age and depending on the numbers you have, is about 40%. Again, those numbers, they can vary. The American Society for Reproductive Medicine has a nonprofit arm that actually tracks these statistics, and it's gotten better year over year as the technology has gotten better. But again, it's not anywhere near 100%. Good question. Okay, so the way AMH plays into this, I said that you will have your AMH levels tested when you go and make your initial appointment with your reproductive endocrinologist. AMH is super important for these, for egg freezing and IVF, and that's because it allows us to predict how many cycles you might have to go through for these to be successful. So if you have low AMH for your age, it could take more cycles to retrieve and implant eggs. And that's super important because this process where you are injecting yourself with hormones and you are going through the whole process, taking time off work, it's not only can be physically and emotionally, but also financially pretty expensive. So if you know that you have low AMH levels, then that can help you plan for that and decide if this is something that might be right for you. If you have high AMH levels, it actually could indicate that it would take fewer cycles. So let's say you're considering egg freezing, you get an AMH test, your levels are high, you might think, okay, well, then I can kind of plan for just doing this once. Again, nothing is perfect, but you can kind of plan for doing this once. And you're then a good candidate for something like egg freezing. And also, because we've gotten so much better at doing egg freezing and IVF, when you get your AMH levels tested, your doctor can actually modify your course of hormonal stimulation to you, which means that these treatments can be a lot more successful. It used to be back in the day where everyone's ovaries were stimulated the same way with the same amount of drugs. But now if you are able to test your AMH, you can actually really modify that course of treatment to have the best amount of success for you. So just wanted to end this on a positive note. We've gone over, your reproductive career, what IVF and egg freezing are, talked about menopause, but let's bring this back to what this means for you. So when you know about your hormone levels and where you stand today, this can help you plan for your future tomorrow. Meaning you can better plan for things like your career, relationships, whether or not you want to go on that 3-month vacation, just generally helps you plan your life. And we at Modern Fertility think that this is health information that we as women have a right to access. So really, that's all for me in terms of the science piece. But again, if you have more questions, feel free to throw them into the Q&A and I'm happy to answer them. But I'm now going to turn it over to Janelle, my colleague, who's going to tell you how you can actually get this information. So thank you guys so much, and I appreciate you joining.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Burke. Hopefully that was interesting for all of you. And as we said, feel free to chime in with questions if anything comes up along the way, or at the end of this, we'll also stick around to answer any additional questions. But we talked a lot about kind of these hormone levels, and we learned why these are important to track. But now, how do we actually get access to this information? To answer this question, I think first we really need to back it up and look at the big picture, which is that we as women are waiting longer than any generation before us to have kids. But the conversation and the dialogue around fertility and family planning just isn't really happening at the right time. We spend so much of our lives worrying about not getting pregnant that when the time comes to start thinking about conceiving and starting a family, we realize that there's still tons of information that we don't have about what's been going on in our own bodies along the way. So let's say that you leave here today and you wanted to get your levels checked. What would that process actually look like? You'd probably go chat with your gynecologist at your next annual appointment, which is a great thought, but actually from what we've seen, most gynecologists don't have the direct experience in ordering these tests and analyzing the results. So they're going to want to send you to a reproductive endocrinologist at a fertility clinic because they're really an expert in all things hormones and fertility and will be able to get into those meaty questions for you. Plus, you really just don't have the time in those quick, 20, 30-minute appointments to get into the questions around fertility and family planning. And really, our healthcare system just isn't set up to support that. On top of all of this, getting this test done at a fertility clinic can cost upwards of $1,500. And generally, insurance only covers it if you can prove you've been trying to conceive for more than 12 months. But let's say you do that, you go through that process, what would your results actually look like? They'd probably look a little something like this. So this is actually our CEO at Modern Fertility and co-founder, Afton, when she went to get her levels checked before starting Modern Fertility. And this is a copy of her actual results. And as you can tell, it's a lot of numbers, a lot of hard data, and really no context around what this means. So she was kind of thinking this here to herself, well, you might be thinking to yourself, which is like, okay, what does this mean? Now what? And from what we've seen, when you chat with your reproductive endocrinologist about these results, you might get conflicting opinions. You might get one doctor who says you should definitely go and spend $10,000 for raising your eggs, and you might get someone else who says something completely different. So ultimately, that's really where Modern Fertility comes in. So we create the same fertility hormone test that's traditionally been given in infertility clinics and make it available to women at home through a very simple finger prick. We believe that access to this information is really one of the biggest issues facing women's health today. And we really are trying to bridge that information gap and have this information be available a lot earlier to us in life so that we can actually plan for our future and our families. So how does our test differ from the test that you would get at a fertility clinic? So this is actually a copy of, or a preview of what our dashboard would look like, and each dashboard is customized to each individual. So when you test with us, you first take a quiz, we ask a little bit about you, your body, what type of birth control you're on, if you're on any, your age, your mother's age when she went through menopause, and we make sure these results are customized to you directly. And what we do is we give you a range, and we make sure that we show you where you fall in that range for your age. But beyond that, we're able to tell you a lot more about what the hormones are and what they mean for your body and for your fertility. So you can probably notice this AMH, the star hormone of today, is one of the main hormones that we test for. But depending on the type of birth control that you're on, we can test for up to 8 different hormones. So we really want to make sure that you have information about what this actually means and what's going on in your body today. So just gonna kind of share a little bit about what this experience is like. If you were to test with us, you order your kit online, it comes in just a few days. And what it is a couple drops of blood that you collect through a little tiny device called a lancet. It's a very simple process, just 4 to 6 drops of blood on a card. You let the card dry, it takes about an hour, and then you pop it in a pre-stamped envelope within 24 hours of testing, and then you get your results uploaded into your customized Modern Fertility dashboard within 10 days. But beyond that, we kind of consider ourselves a lot more than just a test-taking company. We really want to be a resource for you and really provide you with all the tools necessary to better understand your body. So beyond just taking a test with us and getting the results, we provide you with tons of other resources to better understand this process. We give you your hard results as well as a discussion guide that you can chat with your doctor if you want to take that next step. We give you personalized reports. We give you one-on-one consults with a fertility nurse upon receiving your results to make sure you can better understand what this means. We host a weekly webinar that we call an Egginar, which you're welcome to join, which also helps to kind of walk through what these levels mean, what your results mean. And we also have an amazing community of women on Slack that are talking about these topics every single day. So ultimately, we really kind of envision a world where this type of routine testing is something that really every woman has access to. I think we have so much data about everything in our lives, from how many steps we take every single day to our Uber rating, but something as important as fertility is still kind of a black box. So we're really trying to bridge this gap and make sure that women have access to this information a lot earlier in life. So if testing with us is something that you would like to do, we are offering $10 off the test today for joining the webinar, and Mary will be following up with an email and a link to access that. But at this point, I see a couple questions coming in. So I do want to kind of jump in and we can chat with Dr. Erin Burke a little bit more and answer some of these questions. So one question is, I'm on the birth control pill. Should I expect that there will be an amount of time after I go off the pill that it will be tough to get pregnant while my period is regulating, etc.?
That's a great question. I think a lot of us have been, particularly our generation, on the birth control pill for like 10, sometimes 20 years. And you're kind of like, well, what is my body going to be like once I get off the pill? So what we've noticed is that with almost any kind of contraception, and this includes IUDs, patch, pretty much, anything, that most women, about 95%, get pregnant within 1 year. And generally, it takes about 3 months for most birth controls to get out of your system and for your period to regulate. But one thing I want to mention is that if you have been on the birth control pill for a really long time, or any other kind of contraception, what the birth control pill will do is that it will regulate your period. So if you are having issues where, let's say, you're not ovulating because you have polycystic ovarian syndrome, or you have thyroid issues, or there's some other underlying hormonal issue at play, that birth control pill would have been masking that. And when you get off the birth control pill, that's the first time that those issues will become apparent. So I would say that, generally speaking, and again, I'm not your doctor, but generally speaking, after 3 months, if your period doesn't regulate, start to really pay attention and see what's going on and maybe track your period. But then if after a year you aren't able to get pregnant, definitely book an appointment with your doctor. If you're over 35, after 6 months, because again, the older you are, the less time you have, because again, you have fewer eggs and those eggs are of lower quality, unfortunately. But the great thing about modern fertility is we're telling you, try to test these things before there is an issue. And generally, a generation or 2 generations ago, women were getting pregnant in their 20s. And for this year, actually, is the first time ever in the history of the United States that women in their 30s are having children at a higher rate than women in their 20s. And what that means is if you have issues when you try to get pregnant, those issues aren't going to become apparent much later in your age, when you're in your 30s or 40s, than for our mothers or grandmothers' generation, when those issues were becoming apparent when they were trying to get pregnant in their 20s. So if you want to be able to kind of be proactive about this, recommend testing earlier so that you can find out these issues, and then the prognosis is better for you. So that's kind of the genesis behind making sure that these tests are available to women earlier in life, before they start having problems and before they need to be presenting at infertility clinics.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Burke. Hopefully that answered your question. We have a couple more great questions coming in. The next of which is, can you tell us a little bit more about male fertility? When couples have trouble conceiving, how often is it actually because of the male in the relationship?
I'm really glad you guys asked this question. We just spent 45 minutes talking about female fertility, but the stats tell a much different story. 1/3 of couples present at infertility clinics because of what's called male factor infertility. So that's when there's something that's an issue with the male part of the couple. 1/3 is female factor and 1/3 is unknown. So really, males and females equally share that burden of infertility, but so often we only really talk about female infertility. Male fertility is a bit easier to test. So if a male is having issues, there's a couple things that could be at play. One is sperm motility. So that's how well sperm is able to travel. If it can't get up to that curly part of the follicle, or I'm sorry, the fallopian tube, then it's really hard to impregnate your partner. Also look at sperm number. So if you have a very low sperm count, that can also be a problem. And then sperm morphology, or the shape of sperm. Sometimes sperm can have a very strange shape. It can have two heads. It can have a very short tail. All these kinds of things make it a lot harder for the egg to be fertilized. So when a male goes to a fertility clinic, he'll give a semen sample, and then it's easy for the doctor to be able to look at that semen sample under the microscope and figure out what's going on with sperm. It's a lot harder to do that with your eggs, right? Because women ovulate internally. So that's why for a lot of times when we are talking about infertility, we kind of concentrate on the female issue. But you're right, males are share the burden of infertility with females. So I'm really glad you brought that up.
Great. So we have another fantastic question here, which is, how old is too old to freeze your eggs? How do we determine if it still makes sense in the mid to late 30s?
So this is really interesting because, since it's only been since 2014 that elective egg freezing has really been open to the public. So we're only kind of now collecting data on the success rates long-term of women going back to use their eggs. A study came out last year that was kind of looking at what was the ideal age when women froze their eggs that made sense for them financially and in terms of going back to use them. So caveating this story with that there's only about 5 years worth of data. So they started collecting data, I think in 2014, 2015. And have only been able to follow women for a couple years. So what they found, interestingly, was that kind of the sweet spot for freezing your eggs and actually going back to use them was 37, which was a lot older than I had originally anticipated. And what they found is that because women who were 37 were then more likely to use those eggs, because as they got to age 39, age 40, then they decided to use them. Younger women had not yet gone back to use their eggs. Remember, this was only looking at a couple of years worth of data. And they attributed that to potentially younger women who froze their eggs, then found a partner and had children naturally and weren't using their frozen eggs. But it could be that as time goes on, especially as women are completing their families later in life, they might have what's called secondary infertility. So that's where you're able to successfully have your first or your second kid, but if you want other children, and as we're pushing off that age of starting our families, it becomes harder as you get older. So women might then go use the eggs that they had frozen previously to have maybe their second or their third child. So really there's no perfect age, but generally a doctor will say that if you're very seriously considering egg freezing and you have the financial means to do it, then it's not a bad idea. But again, personal decision for you, your finances, your emotions. We didn't really talk about this, but when you're giving yourself these 1 to 2 weeks of hormone shots, it makes you a little bit crazy sometimes. I say that lightly, the word crazy, but you're pumping yourself full of hormones and you can feel very uncomfortable and have an emotional response to that. So that's something to also consider.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Burke. I think at this point, if you guys have any additional questions, you can feel free to shoot us an email at support@modernfertility.com, and we'll be happy to answer them. I know that Mary will also be sending a follow-up mail with some of the outline of what we talked about today, as well as that link to purchase your test with us if that's something that you're interested in. So at this point, I think I will probably pass it back off to Mary, and that's all for us here at Modern Fertility.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burke and Janelle, and thanks to all of you who joined us. It's such great information. And like Janelle said, we will be in touch with a ton of great follow-up information and how you can stay connected with both Fairy Godboss and Modern Fertility. Thanks again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your Thursday. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.